Well, hey, I'm Jeff Forster. I'm one of the pastors here, and we just want to say thank you for coming, being a part of what's happening here at Heritage Church. God has been blessing us in extraordinary ways, and you picked a great weekend to join us as we're kicking off a brand new series. I'm really excited about this one called Stand, and over the next several weeks, we're going to go through the life of Daniel and how he stood in all of the key elements of his life and in very difficult circumstances, and I think it's very, very practical for the situation we find ourselves in sometimes in life. And so that's what we're going to talk about. But before we do that, I'd just like to celebrate a couple things. Over the last 2 weeks, we had a team down in Cuba, and we had a team that just returned back yesterday. I was on the team that went to Kenya, just returned back yesterday. By the way, we went like 30-something hours without sleep, so who knows what I'm going to say today, but it's probably going to be fun. That's all I have to say about that. And man alive, I was so worried because my oldest son and his wife, they're getting ready to have our first grandson. And yeah, I know. And I've been practicing. I yell at everybody who gets in our yard. And I've been talking about my bursitis and my bad back and just being grumpy, saying whatever crosses my mind. Because once you're a grandpa, you can say whatever, right? So that's been it. But he's due, our grandson is due on the 4th. But I was going to be gone until yesterday, the 1st. And so I told him before I left, now, Rowan, I don't want you to be born until I get back. And he's such an obedient little grandson already. I'm so happy about that. So he waited. And then I said, no, you can be born from the time the plane lands until about midnight on Saturday. But then Grandpa's got to preach on Sunday and then lunch. So if you could be born after lunch on Sunday. And right now, best that we can figure, it's going to happen. So that's good. We'll make it at least to lunch. And then after that, my week is his, whatever he wants after that. But our team returned from Kenya. We saw hundreds of people find Jesus in the eastern portion near Guantanamo, up in the mountains and stuff. So that was really great. Yeah. And then the team that returned from Kenya, we spent a bunch of time, many of you would remember in December and January, we invited you to join us to start 100 new churches in around the world in 2019. And so we work with a group called the Timothy Initiative, and we raised about $30,000, which is we raised $33,000, I think, which is 110 churches. And we felt like that was a 2-year strategy. That's about how long it takes. We went out to work with the Pokot people, which is the tribe we're working with in Kenya. They're a forgotten people. Nobody cares about the Pokot really hardly in the world. And we love them, and we've been serving them. And so that's where we decided to focus. And here's the report I got back. We have 107 church planters in the development process right now getting trained. Almost half the churches are planted already. And it was supposed to be a 2-year strategy, and we're halfway through. They say they'll be done before the end of the year with 110 new churches. I know, it's amazing. That's fantastic. To put that in perspective for you, every one of these churches is in an area that has no church. And in many of those places, I've had people tell me before, we don't know who Jesus is. We've never heard his name before. This is the area that if you've heard me tell the story before about the old guy who said, we don't know who he is, but we'll help you find him if you tell us what village he's from. That's where we're at. In that area, there's 100 new churches we planted this year. And they just came and asked us, would you help us start 250 more in the next 2 years? They want to start 10 new training centers. And we said, yes, we're going to find a way. So that was cool. Also, those of you who have been attending Heritage for a while, you know that when we work with the Pokot people, we're also helping dig wells and start schools and that kind of thing. And between our partnership with the Pokot and Kensington and Venture Church over in Heartland and a few others, it looks like we're on pace to get a well for every 1,000 people in Pokot and a church started for every 1,000 people within the next 5 to 7 years. Yeah, that's just incredible. We're so excited about that. The Pokots say we can do it faster. The problem is that's still about an $18 million solution, so we got to figure this out. The water thing is, so if you got a couple 18 million laying around, talk to me after the service. I'll be out in the lobby. Not for us. We don't want it, but well, we do, but we don't need it. We want to help the Pokot. The reason why water is so important is maybe one of the most dehumanizing things that can happen on the planet is when a woman can't protect her babies. And 7 out of 10 Pokot babies die before they turn 5. And it's just because of water. It's the only reason. So for $18 million, we can solve that for over 1 million people. And when you can provide food and water security everything else in society begins to build. But right now, they sit right on this edge all the time of dying. We were in places, we didn't make a big deal about it with our team. It's a little hard. You're sitting right on the edge of just unbelievable circumstances. But one of the pastors came and mentioned to me that a couple of the children we had to send to one of the orphanages we help support because the mother starved to death keeping her babies alive. So food and water. Very significant. So anyways, we've got this really great video we'll show you next week maybe, and we're really excited about that. So when we bring water, that's important, and then Jesus is the water of life, right? And so when we bring those two things, society begins to get established, which lets us bring education. The children, they're nomadic, so they leave, but when we dig a well, the families stay near the well, which lets us have a school, lets us start clinics. Of course, the church becomes kind of the center of that community. They stop raiding, they stop killing, and one of the things, Karamojong, Sabay, Turkana, and the Pokot all fight each other. They tell horror stories about how bad Karamojong are. They don't have like boogeyman stories. They say, and if you're a bad little kid, Karamojong sneak in the window at night and eat little babies, right? That's just really scary stuff. They hate each other. They fight each other all the time. But since the Pokot started finding Jesus, instead of fighting and killing them, they just came and said, we want to dig some wells for our enemies to let them know that Jesus changed us. Yeah. That's cool. So, anyways, really exciting. Your investment, what you decided to do for people maybe you won't ever meet till you get to heaven. Unless you, hey, come with me. We'll just take all of you. It's only like $3,000. So all you people just come with us. We'll go visit next time. You'll see what I'm talking about. But, we have this thing, we work very carefully with very specific groups because there's lots of people who abuse all kinds of stuff around the world, take advantage of well-meaning people. We trust, but we verify. And that's what we did is we went on this trip. We just want to make sure it was moving in the right direction. And instead, they're almost done. And we went and visited some of those places, some of those churches. It's just incredible. So your investment is delivering. And not only that, we've already seen hundreds of people find Jesus. We're already, we wound up seeing a new well open up. We found new water at one of the places we were traveling with a geologist, all those things. We're very, very excited. What you're doing matters. And when you get to heaven, you'll get to spend eternity hearing all their stories about how your generosity changed their lives. And so I just want to thank you. As a representative that represented you, I said hi from Heritage Church. And now I'm saying hi from them to you. Congratulations. You guys are doing just a fantastic job. So with that being said, grab your notes out of your program. We're jumping into this brand new message series called Stand. It's built around the life of Daniel. And Jesus says there's going to be times you're going to have to take a stand in your life for what is right because you're not, if you're a follower of Jesus, not of this world. Your values are not the same values as the rest of the world. You don't believe the same things the rest of the world believes. You live in a different way. And so Jesus says this. He says, Father, I don't ask you to take my followers out of the world, but keep them safe from the evil one. They don't belong to this world, neither do I. Your word is the truth, so let this truth make them completely yours, and I'm sending them into the world just as you sent me. When he's talking about the world, he's not talking about the planet. He's talking about the world's value systems, the system of this world, the way that everybody else thinks, every way that everybody else lives, the way that everybody else believes. He said, they're not of that system. They're of the heavenly system, of God's system. And so he said, I'm sending them into this foreign system because I want them to change the world. But if you're going to make a change, everybody who changes the world, they weren't concerned about fitting in. As a matter of fact, every life-changing thing that's happened, every invention, they told the Wright brothers they were crazy. Right? They over and over and over and over and over again, they questioned sometimes Einstein's sanity and his mental capacity. They challenged Edison's just almost religious focus on trying to get things done. They said, this guy's just a little nuts. And yet, they weren't worried about fitting in. They were willing to do whatever it took, even though it made them stand out in order to change the world and make the world better. And if you're going to live for Jesus, and if you're going to live for Jesus' system, just expect to stand out. That's the first point in your notes there, if you're filling in the blanks. If you live for Jesus, expect to stand out. So the question is, how do I stand out in the right ways? How do I stand out at the right time? How do I stand out for the right reason? God's not calling you to be weird. Did you know, how many of you know a weird Christian? Anybody know a weird? Go ahead, it's okay. It's okay. Don't point at them. Come on, man. Yeah, so did you know a weird Christian is just a weird Christian? That's what they are. Right? God's not celebrating weird people. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying be weird. He just said sometimes you just have to stand up. And that's what we're talking about today as we look into that. So the next 5 weeks, I think, as we look into this incredible person, Daniel, and his life, I think over the next 5 weeks, it has the potential to impact your life in a significant way. If you take a stand for the right things at the right time and you do it in the right way, this has potential to change the course of your life and maybe the course of your family's lives. But compromise, if you compromise the wrong things, if you compromise at the wrong times, if you compromise for the wrong reasons, it could cost you and the people you love far more than you can imagine. And so we're going to tear apart a little bit of the first portion of the book of Daniel. This week we're talking about standing out for God. Next week we'll talk about standing up for what's right, how to do that without being a jerk. Standing for what matters is week 3. On week 4 we're going to talk about standing against temptation, how to win in your life and have victory. And week 5 we're going to talk about standing with God and with others for justice. And I think you're going to really like it. So let me give you some background. There's this guy in history, and he's mentioned many times in the Bible. He was the king of Babylon. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. And when I say Nebuchadnezzar, you say, boo. No, I'm joking. He's the bad guy in this narrative. Nebuchadnezzar historically was one of, until the Greek Empire, maybe one of the most dominant emperors and kings and military minds in history. Only the pharaohs and Nebuchadnezzar were those, some of the pharaohs. It would be on that level. Egypt and Babylon dominated the most of culture at that time. And Nebuchadnezzar was particularly brutal, and he didn't only wage physical war. There was a lot of mental warfare and emotional warfare in what he did as well. And so he had tried to get Israel to submit to him, and the Israelites refused, and so he said, fine, we're rolling in. And they rolled in with a massive army and just obliterated Jerusalem. They tore down the walls, they burnt the houses, they raped the women, they killed the men, and they got to the temple of God, and they destroyed the temple. They destroyed all of the things inside of the temple just about, and it was this warfare was not just about subjugation. Oftentimes the Romans would do, when you get 1,000 years later or whatever, the Romans, 700 years, the Romans would come through, they would do whatever it took to win a battle, and then as soon as that was done, they would allow that culture to stand. You can keep your culture and keep your religion, just pay taxes, because we just want you to fund the war machine for Rome. But in Nebuchadnezzar's day, it was obliterate your culture. And so they come in, they wipe everything out, they completely destroy every Israelite's present. Their life, their culture, their way of thinking. They even destroyed their religion, destroyed everything. They destroyed the kingdom. They humiliate God's people by taking all of their faith symbols from the temple as treasure, or they destroyed some of them. And then even more than that, he not only wanted to destroy their present kingdom and their present religion, he wanted to destroy their future. There's no hope that you're ever going to be able to reestablish what you had. And so here we are, it's about 605 BC, and he comes in and he takes the best young leaders of all of Israel. He's intentionally going to indoctrinate them into Babylonian culture and train them to become future government leaders and advisors to the king. And what he was doing was he said, we're going to indoctrinate all these young future leaders of Israel so that they believe in our system and they live and think our way and they have our values, and they will completely walk away from your system. And there's no future that you're ever going to be able to rebuild. So it's in that context that a few of these young men did not. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had always been successful whenever he tried to do this in the other cultures, and so there's no reason why it wouldn't have worked here. But there's these 4 young men who stand up, and that's what I want to talk about today. So in Daniel chapter 1 is where it's at. It's in your notes too. We'll put it up on the big screen. But here's a few lessons from the life of Daniel. Here's what it says. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials. Can you imagine growing up in 5th grade with the name Ashpenaz? You'd hope his friends would call him Ash, right? Hey, Ash, right? That's what you hope. Anyways, his name's Ashpenaz, and he's the chief of the king's court officials. And he ordered him to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility of Israel. These are the elite young men. And these are young men without any physical defect. They're handsome and showing aptitude, a lot like me. No, I'm joking. That's terrible. A lot like you. You're the smart ones. You came to Heritage Church this morning. That's pretty smart. So he says, nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. And he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So he brings in the elite, the future leaders, the ones that would be able to lead Israel forward. And he brings them in and says, okay, Ashpenaz, I want you to teach these men the language. And I want you to teach them the literature of Babylonians. Now, what's extraordinary about this is here, according to historically, they were somewhere, all these young men, there were hundreds and hundreds of them, somewhere between 12 and 16 or 17. That's what you're talking about. So young teenage men. And this was a very intentional and very strategic plan to indoctrinate these young boys into the Babylonian culture. Here's what I want you to do, Ashpenaz. I want you to bring the elite, the very best from among them, and I want them to eventually think like Babylonians and talk like Babylonians and behave like Babylonians and believe what Babylonians believe. Now, throughout Scripture, Nebuchadnezzar is like a metaphor for Satan as well. So Nebuchadnezzar was a real guy, Satan's a real person, but sometimes they would kind of say Nebuchadnezzar behaves like Satan would behave. And he's very similar in that this enemy of your soul, this enemy of your family, this enemy of all of your future, the enemy of God, Satan, he has a plan too. He wants your family, he wants you to think like the world. He wants you to behave like the world. He wants you to believe like the world. And so there's this full-scale attack on you and on your family that seduces and lies and deceives. And he's using all kinds of tools. They're good in and of themselves or neutral in and of themselves. They can be used for good or evil. But media, advertisements, music, all these things, there's all these subtle messages. You're never going to be happy unless you buy some of this. The world's never going to get better unless everybody thinks this way, believes this way, behaves this way. So Nebuchadnezzar understood the value of this. What I think determines how I live. If you're filling in the blanks. What I think determines how I live. So if we can change how they think, if they can learn to think different, they'll start behaving different, they'll start having different values, all those things. And we will eliminate what God was doing in their culture, and we will impose the culture that we want on them. So God tells us in Romans chapter 12, he says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you, what? Think. And then you'll learn how God's will for you, learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Circle that word, changing the way you think. Many people try God out. Man, my marriage is in a rough shape. My finances are a little tough. Circumstances are rough. My kid came home and said a naughty word from kindergarten, and it's time to get in church and get our life turned around, right? And we come in and we try God out just a little bit, but we keep living the way the world lives. We keep believing the way the world believes. We keep doing the things that the world does. We don't. We keep thinking like the world thinks. But God says transformation, real breakthrough, power in your life comes from when you allow God to change how you think about life. And then everything else begins to change around that. But listen, you can't just passively function and succeed and win and find victory in your life as a passive Christian, right? So many people go, yeah, I guess I'm a Christian. Well, why are you a Christian? I'm not Buddhist. I'm not Muslim. I don't worship the devil. So I guess I'm a Christian. I go to church with grandma on Easter and Christmas, but I'm not one of those religious nuts. Otherwise, I'm always blending into the world. There's no real outward sign that I'm a Christian. I'm just a cultural Christian. And I would say this, if you keep doing what everybody else does, if you keep believing how everybody else believes, if you keep living like everybody else lives, you're going to get the same results everybody else gets, which is what's driven you to this point where you say, I need to try God out. It's because you've been doing those things. So God says, listen, you can't just go halfway on this. I would say this, in almost 30 years of ministry, 30 years of ministry, it's completely impossible to be a sort of, kind of cultural Christian and still have the spiritual success and victory against the temptations and the darkness of this world. You can't just be sort of in and have the victory that God wants you to have in your life. It's the same thing. You can't have one meal a week and live. and be strong and successful. You can't just work out once in January and be fit the whole rest of the year. We know that. You know that, right? Okay. So it's just not possible. You can't do that. You can't just get one tank of gas and drive for the whole year, right? You need to constantly be refilling it. You can't go to church for 65 minutes a week. Let me change that. Some of you came in about 15 minutes late. 50 minutes a week. Yes, I did. You can't come to church for 50 minutes a week, like twice a month, and expect that you're going to have the kind of spiritual power that you're looking for. You can't expect to grow and thrive spiritually, and you need to be all in to really learn to hear God's voice in your life, and to live by faith and not by sight, and to have the full power of God's Spirit in your life, and to experience the mighty power of God that gives you victory and breakthrough that you and your family desperately need when you're just kind of mailing it in. When we went to Kenya, we had several people who had to go get all their shots, which is always fun. You go get 7 or 8 shots, And one of them is yellow fever, because you can go there without a yellow fever shot. You just can't get back in the country sometimes without a yellow fever shot. And so when you go get yellow fever, they give you a live culture. So they're giving you yellow fever. It's not dead. It's alive still, but they give you just enough that your body can defeat it. I remember when I got my first yellow fever shot, it made me sick. I didn't feel well for a couple days. And but here's what happens. Your body, because they just give you a little bit, your body recognizes it and goes, oh, hey, that's bad, fights it. From that point on, you can't get yellow fever anymore because you've been what? What is that called? You've been inoculated. Yeah, inoculated. Here's what happens with our 50 minutes of church and no other Jesus the rest of the week is we're inoculating our children. It's no wonder they think and act and behave just like all the other worldly children, is because we're inoculating them to Jesus. It's the same thing we do in our own lives. We have just enough that we never truly experience the power of God in our life, because we're just kind of mailing it in a little bit. And this is what happens. Anyways, I'm not saying shame on you. I'm just telling you there's so much more if you choose to go all in. But if you go all in, you're going to stand out. Sometimes, though, you just need to take a stand. You need to take a stand for what matters most, and you do it in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. And that's what we're going to look at Daniel's life for. Because if you're never standing out and you're always fitting in, then there's a really good chance that you're not truly committed to following Jesus, because there is a cost to following Christ, and sometimes it's a social cost. So here we go. Daniel chapter 1, verse 5. It says, then the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. How nice is that? Woo, I just spent the last week eating goat and rice and goat and more rice and more goat. So I came home this morning, I had a sausage biscuit and a hash brown on the way here. Ice in my Coke. It was amazing. So anyways, let's move on. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. This is really important. We'll come back to that in a minute. That's why I pointed it out. They were to be trained for 3 years. So, they'd be 16, 17, 18. They'll be 19, 20, 21, something like that. And they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. It's a pretty good job. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are their Hebrew names. And the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So you've heard of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, maybe. Maybe not. If you haven't, we're going to tell that story here in a couple weeks. But here's these young men in their early or mid-teens. They're uprooted from their family. They're moved over 1,000 miles away from home. And then he very strategically begins to strip them of their identity. He begins to crush any sense of dignity for being an Israelite. And he begins to change their names. Now, all of their names, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all of their names were specifically named as words that pointed you to worship God. So one talks about the presence of God. One talks about the power of God. One talks about the mercy and love of God. That's their name. So every time, Daniel's mom called him or Hananiah's dad called his name, it was a subtle reminder to worship God. God is your God. Yahweh is our God. The God of Israel is the one true God. It was constantly, as a matter of fact, one of the young men's names, that's what it meant, was the one true God. So the Babylonians take their names away from them and give them a name that is directly corresponding, but only now it's to Babylonian gods. Your God is nothing because you've been defeated. Now you worship our gods. So now, every time Belteshazzar was called, he was being reminded to worship the gods of Babylon. Every time Shadrach or Meshach and Abednego were being called by those Babylonian names, they were being reminded of the fact that they were no longer at home. They were no longer who they were previous. Now they've a new culture, a new mindset, and you have new gods. And then they changed their diet, right? They're supposed to eat food prepared for the king, meat and wine that are dedicated to pagan gods. Here's what happened in Babylon. People would bring the very finest wine. They would bring the finest foods, and they would make sacrifices to the Babylonian gods. And then Nebuchadnezzar, we see this later in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar actually set himself up as a god. And so he was the one, his people would come and collect all of those sacrifices, the finest cuts of meat, the finest wines to the gods, would be brought to the king's palace, and that's what they would eat. So it wasn't so much about the hamburgers or the filet mignon that was available from the king's table. It was the fact that it was dedicated as an act of worship to gods that stood against the God of Israel, the one true God. And so they had this sense that, we're not going to sin against our God. We're not going to honor the worship of other gods with even the simplest things like the kind of food we eat. And I just want you to fill this in. My lifestyle matters more than labels. My lifestyle matters more than labels. They took away the name. You don't find the boys fighting about their names. But they begin to insist that they start to participate in the worship of pagan gods. And these guys begin to dig in and say, hey, we're not going that direction with you. So my lifestyle, what I do, how I live, really matters. It matters far more than what people think about me or call me. So the Bible says in verse 8, it says, but Daniel resolved. Circle that word resolved. A resolution is usually before a problem happens. It's anticipatory. So when you make a resolution in January, I'm going to lose 25 pounds, that's before the 25 pounds comes off, right? When you make a resolution, you determine before the problem happens, you determine, I'm going to cut back on Coke, or I'm going to work out 1 hour a day, or I'm going to go on more dates with my spouse this year, whatever. It's a pre-decision. You'd make the decision before the opportunity happens. And so that's the idea of a resolution. Daniel resolved, before this opportunity ever came up, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So he asks for permission. I'll get back to that in just a minute. There's a right way to take a stand. They didn't enlist Antifa and start burning down the villages and protesting, down with Nebuchadnezzar, down with, that's not happening. So anyways, they didn't fight when their names were taken because outward labels don't really matter. They knew who they were, and they knew who they were in God. They knew who their parents raised them to be. So Daniel doesn't defend his own name, but he does take a stand when God's name would be defamed. When they were going to be forced to worship other gods, have other values and other priorities, then he takes a stand because he resolved not to eat any food that had been dedicated to pagan gods. Let me just help you fill in a few blanks here. In your notes, fill in this blank. Be decisive in advance. Know why I believe what I believe. There's so many people who I've talked to, in life, they're starting to raise their own family, and they'll start talking about their religious experience, and they'll talk about how, they were always told, their religion said, don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and as a kid, they were resentful because they never understood why. And oftentimes, they weren't taught why. But here's these 4 young men, teenagers, and they know why they believe what they believe, not just what they believe. The why is what's important. Start with the why when you're trying to teach your young people, when you're trying to understand for yourself how to live. They understood why they believed what they believed, and they were decisive in advance. Hey, listen, he could have rationalized this in a million ways. You know what? God's going to understand. I don't want to eat this food, but it's the only food that's being put in front of me. God's going to understand. If God hadn't want me to eat this food, then he wouldn't have let my country be defeated. If I don't do it, I'm going to stand out because everybody else, even all of the other Jewish kids, are eating this food. Everybody else is doing it. I don't want to be some kind of weirdo. It's not hurting anybody. What is it? It's just a steak. It's just a little bit of grape juice, man. It's not going to ruin my life. And besides that, I have to eat. If I don't eat, I'm going to die. So they could have justified it a million ways, but instead, he predetermined through his resolution ahead of time that he was willing to stand out for God. And so he had to make some decisions ahead of time. Your success in almost every area of life, especially in your spiritual life, is determined by what you decide ahead of time. You have to have things where you've predetermined, you've predecided, you've resolved in your heart that you will never do X, Y, Z. And then you have to have some things in your life where you've predecided you will always be and do like this. So maybe you're one of those people and you're not yet married, or maybe you are post-marriage or whatever. The Bible says that we're supposed to honor God, that we're supposed to honor marriage by all. The Bible says marriage is to be honored by all, and the marriage bed undefiled. And so for single people, what that would mean is that you would honor a future marriage that you have not yet entered into by the way you choose to live today. This is why God puts a ban on sexual activity outside of marriage, because you're honoring the future marriage. You're honoring the fact that God has established marriage as this right and good and holy and perfect thing. And so you give your life and you give your body as a sacrifice to God, and you wait. So maybe you've predetermined, hey, I'm going to predetermine I'm not going to have sex until I'm married. The time to make that decision is before you lose your flipping mind in the back seat of the car. Because you're wired that way. We all are. Humans are wired that way. Once the hormones take over, you're not in your right mind. You're just not. So that's not the time you go, well, gee, I just hope I make better decisions next time. Right? Because you're not in your right mind. You're not bad. You're just doing the wrong thing because you're not thinking clearly. That's it. So you have to predetermine how you're going to behave beforehand. Maybe you just decide, hey, I'm not going to get in the back of the car. That might be it. For you, it might be alcohol. You got to predetermine ahead of time not to get drunk. The best way not to get drunk? Don't drink. That's it. So maybe, if that's an issue for you, maybe the best thing to do is predetermine ahead of time. Hey, I love you guys. You guys are amazing. I'm just not going to go to that club. I'm not going to go to that bar. That might be it. You might have to predetermine that that's too big of a risk for you. That's okay. It's not about making rules. It's about choosing to live wisely. And a wise person pre-decides things so that they're not trying to struggle through the difficult decision in the heat of the battle in that moment when you're so tempted. It might be about private conversations about your boss or whatever. It might be, hey, listen, how crazy is this? We all know people where, I don't know if you knew this. From my perspective, marriage is always amazing. My bride is perfect. But I've heard rumors, that sometimes marriage is not always amazing every single day for a lot of people. That's what I've heard. It's amazing for me, but for others, no. My wife is here, so. Sometimes it's just work. I've had people been married 40, 50 years that have told me before, you know what, sometimes you just decide to stay married. One of the most dangerous things we can do is start having intimate conversations with somebody of the opposite sex at work about our marriage. Oh, man, she's so nice. And, of course, she's always put together at work on her best behavior. He's so caring when I talk about how tough it is at home with my stupid moron husband. It won't do nothing. And he's so caring. He's just like a brother at work. Ooh, got right here. I'm sorry. There's no such thing as a brother or sister at work. There's always an ulterior motive. So maybe you have to decide ahead of time, You're not going to have intimate conversations about your spouse with people of the opposite sex. Maybe you decide that ahead of time. Be friendly, be nice, but you don't have to get pulled into those things. I have to predetermine what I'm going to do. So I predetermine what I'm not going to do. I'm just not going to get caught up in those things so that I make the right decisions and my life winds up being better and stronger and I have the power of God in my life and I have all those breakthroughs and victories that I desperately need. Then I have to decide there's some things I'm going to do. I'm going to spend time with God. So maybe if you have a really hectic life, a crazy life, that might mean you have to predetermine ahead of time, I just need to get up about an hour earlier than everybody else so that I can spend a little time with God. That might be it. It might be, hey, we're church-going people, and so we're going to go to church. Soccer is not more important than time with God and God's family. Volleyball is not more important than God's family and spending time with God in the church. All these other things. So we're going to find a way. We're going to go to the day. If you could just find a church that had Monday night services, you wouldn't have to skip church every weekend. If you can make it to work, you can go to church. Oh, Heritage Church has Monday night services. You could go to the graduation party and the baseball game and get a camp out night. And if you could make it to work and worship the dollar in the morning on Monday, you could come to church in the evening too. You could predetermine to do the right thing all the time. Man, I'm sassy today. You guys should not give me a week off, man, because I come back ready to go. You know, I'm gonna predetermine. I'm gonna keep my eyes pure, and I'm gonna only look at the right things. And maybe you have to decide that, hey, you're gonna move the computer up into the family spaces instead of the basement at 1 o'clock in the morning, right? That might be it. It might just be that there's certain channels you don't need. I'm gonna be honest and pure in my business strategies. Maybe that's it. It doesn't matter that the rest of the business world has to, scam and shoot a move. Alexander Hamilton, he didn't write any of the Bible, but he did say this. He said, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. It's true. So Jesus says this in John chapter 8. Jesus told the people who had faith in him, what people did Jesus talk to? People who what? Had faith in him. If I asked you, how many of you have faith in Jesus? Many of you would raise your hand. So he's talking to you here. And he says, if you keep on obeying, circle the word obeying what I've said, you truly are my disciples. He doesn't say if you keep on believing what I've said. He said, if you keep doing what I've said. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Okay, so Jesus does not say you believe the truth, and believing the truth sets you free. You do the truth, and doing the truth sets you free. Right? Isn't that what he's saying? So when you do what he tells you to do, now you know what's true. And that truth sets you free. Real freedom. The breakthrough you're looking for is not just going to church and believing what Jeff said today. Real breakthrough, real freedom, real victory that you're looking for comes from going all in and deciding to apply what God says from his word. And when you're applying it, that's when you're set free. So this looks like a one-time event for these guys, right? They make this one announcement and suggest a solution, and it looks like a one-time thing. But the problem is it's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day after day after day. This is a decision that they lived every day, and they stood out again and again and again. This wasn't a public show just to show off and be jerks. This was a bold display of the fact that they had faith in the one true God and that they believed he would deliver them in this situation. So Daniel comes and very diplomatically, he asks for permission, right? Isn't that what he did in that previous one? And then here's what he says in verse 12 and 13. Please, he's being nice, he's being polite. Please test he's not typing in all caps. Ashpenaz is such an idiot. We hate this guy. He has no concept of what's right and wrong. Where's your morality? I bet you voted for the wrong candidate. Instead, he comes respectfully, and he says, please test your servants for 10 days. So Daniel comes with a reasonable solution, and there's an end to it. Let's test it. What happens is it took the pressure off of Daniel, and it took the pressure off of Ashpenaz, and put it on God. That's what happens. He says, give us nothing but vegetables to eat or water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he comes in, he respectfully provides another solution that had a measurable time frame in it, and just said, let's see if God shows up. So fill in this blank. Be diplomatic. So as I've mentioned this before, jerk Christians are just jerk Christians. That's what they are. Right? Being a Christian does not give you permission to be a jerk. You can still stand for what's right without being mean or whatever. Okay. Pray for diplomacy, that's what I'm saying. Peter tells us this. Make sure that in your hearts you honor Christ as the Lord. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the hope you have. Be ready to give the reason for it, but do it how? Gently and with respect. Circle those words and type those out in capital letters. So Daniel 1:14 says, so he agreed to this. So Ashpenaz says, hey, that's reasonable. And tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So instead of making a public protest, instead of trying to develop an uprising, Daniel honors authority. God tells us to honor authority, and he creates a plan. He doesn't just come in and say, I'm not going to do that, find another way. Instead, he honors authority, he's respectful, and then he offers maybe another little experiment that would maybe give God an opportunity to show up. Did you know it's possible for you to stand up in the wrong way? It is. And so he doesn't point out, hey, you guys are jerks. He just prays, God, give me wisdom, give me diplomacy, help me, provide a way out. And then God does, and he offers a solution, and Ashpenaz takes it. So pray that God will give you the wisdom to stand out in the right way. One of my heroes for a number of years has been a guy named Buck Jacobs. Buck is in his 80s now. He's been a great mentor and Christian discipler of CEOs and business executives around the country for years and years. Back when he was a young man in business, he went into business. He has a scientific background. Some of the other guys, they invented and were working on some of these solutions that some of the manufacturing companies needed. And so Buck winds up pulling into the marketing side of it to develop some relationships and start making a lot of money. And during that time, Buck had just become a Christian. His boss and a couple of the other executives in the business would gather together in the morning and they'd have devotions together. And Buck was part of that. One of the devotions that they had was talking about doing everything as if you're doing it for Christ. The problem was, in their marketing department, they had slipped into doing whatever it took to land the deal. Their largest contract, by far and away their biggest buyer, was, they were based out of Chicago, their biggest buyer was in Cleveland. And they had started finding out, back in those days, you wine and dine. You still do, I guess. A lot of questionable practices. There was some alcohol that these guys liked, top shelf, that was a lot cheaper in Chicago. You didn't have to pay the taxes. And so they'd bring boxes of that in illegally, and they do all kinds of stuff in the clubs and all the stuff that these Christians are going, man, we're doing the wrong thing, but, that's just the price of doing business in this economy. So it comes out in one of those devotion moments among these Christian leaders, we're doing the wrong thing. We're sacrificing our integrity just to land the deal. And so they went to the largest purchaser and said, listen, we need to apologize because we're crossing the line with our own values. And it's just to land a deal. So here's what we promise. We promise you we give you the best product at the best possible price. But no longer are we going to sacrifice our integrity and do what we believe is wrong in order to land your contract. And we promise that to God. And so whatever you decide, it doesn't matter. We're going to do the right thing. It's millions of dollars. So the plant manager calls them back. Said, hey, I heard what you did. And Buck said, man, here it goes. We're going to lose this contract. The guy says, I can have a respect for somebody who says I'm not going to cross my moral and integrity boundaries just to land a deal. And if you do that in your own life, you're going to do it for me too. Besides that, I'm not going to find any place that has a better product for a better price. And he upped his purchase. So that doesn't always happen for everybody. Later on, you're going to find out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get thrown in the fire. So it doesn't always work out that way. It doesn't, but in Buck's situation, it did. Hey, we're willing to lose our business over doing it the right way rather than sacrificing our integrity, having a hard time going to sleep every night. That's what they did. So you got to be disciplined, really. Once you decide you're willing to stand out, you got to be disciplined to practice what I preach, right? I got to practice what I preach. You got to practice what you preach. So God shows up then. They stand there and in a polite way ask for a better way, and God gives them knowledge and he gives them understanding. They wind up doing better in school than everybody else, and Daniel could even understand visions and dreams, which is precisely what Nebuchadnezzar was looking for in his top level advisors. And so here's what it says in Daniel 1:17. These 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So these guys were willing to do whatever it took. Now, they were already elite. So were all the other young men. But God says, you see those 4? Those guys are awesome. They're willing to do whatever it takes to stand up for me. And circle the words God gave, because God's the one who stepped in. God gave them the ability to navigate through that sticky situation. God gave them all the advantage. God gave them the breakthrough. God gave them the victory. God's the one who does it in you and through you when you choose to give it all to him and go all in with him. So then in verse 19 it says, the king talked with them and he found none equal to Daniel or Hananiah or Mishael or Azariah. Talking about changing the world, because we'll get into this. It's unbelievable how God uses these guys. If Daniel and his buddies had simply blended in, just, hey, don't rock the boat, man. We didn't choose this situation. Besides that, this food's pretty good. If they had just chosen to simply blend in, nothing historic would have happened. We wouldn't even know their names. It wouldn't matter. Isn't that the kind of life you want to live? Don't you want to live a life that matters, that really makes a difference, that lives beyond your life? One of the things you're going to have to do is choose not to blend in. There's been billions of people that have lived that just blend in, just go along. And instead, because these guys were willing to stand up for what was right, and they stood up in the right way, and they stood up at the right time for the right things, it worked. And now we know about them. If they'd blended in, we wouldn't have known about them. If they had stubbornly refused to eat and had decided to protest, they would have likely been executed. Time and again, you'll be lured in to this idea. Just blend in. Don't stand out. Don't rock the boat. The administration's not going to like it. The bosses aren't going to like it. The executives aren't going to like it. Your friends are going to think you're crazy or weird. You can do that. You can blend in, or you can take a stand and stand out. And that's when you start changing your life and the lives of the people around you. My life has been this way all of my life. I'd rather be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in. I'd rather be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in. So here's the last point. We're done. Expect to become prominent when you stand out. When you stand up. Expect to become prominent. Now, you become prominent one of two ways. Promoted or persecuted. But at least you won't be forgotten. For Daniel, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were both. They got promoted and they were persecuted. And God showed up in both situations every time. We'll unpack that over the next few weeks. For some of you, say, I don't even have God in my life at all. This is why Jesus came. He came so you could have a relationship with God. He came to set you free from all those things that are holding you back. And it starts with letting him forgive your sins, inviting him into your life, making him the boss, and going his way. And he says, this is all you have to do is receive this free gift. You ask Jesus into your life. So in a moment, I'm going to pray, and maybe that's where you're at. You'll cross that line with me. But for others in this room, most of the people, perhaps you've already crossed that line of faith, but now you've got some big decisions to make. It's easy to just go along. It's easy just to blend in. But God, the real power happens when you're willing to stand out. That's when God shows up. That's when God gives you what you need. So maybe it's just reminding yourself one more time that Jesus is really Lord. He's not just a nice guy that you're fond of and glad that he's taking you to heaven, but he really is the Lord, the King, the boss of your life. And you're going to do what he says to do. And that's when the power happens. Would you pray with me? So God, thank you for meeting with us today. Thank you for showing us a better way through Daniel. As we go into this message series, we're very excited about all these opportunities that you're going to remind us of and point us to. But today, as we're talking about making the right choices, sometimes it's going to make us stand out. God, help us be willing to do so, not sacrifice our integrity just for another dollar, not sacrifice our values just for one more ball game, but to go all in with you, not inoculate ourselves and our family, but to go all in with you and let your power fill us. So God, we're looking forward to seeing what you're going to do in our lives because of that, reminding ourselves that you're really the Lord. For some in the room, you say, you know what, Jeff, I'm that guy. I need God in my life. I don't even have any power of God in my life. I need Jesus to forgive my sins. Well, if that's you, maybe pray like this. Maybe say, God, I know I'm a sinner, but I believe that Jesus paid the price and he rose again so I could be free from those things. So Jesus, forgive me. Forgive me for my past. Give me hope for the future. Give me power to live the life that you made me live today. I want you to be the boss, the Lord of my life. I'll follow you for the rest of my life. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.